Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Ranger. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Your comments are always a pleasure to read. And if these stories help you relax or fall asleep, hitting the like button supports the channel more than you might think. Now take a moment to get ready and settle in comfortably. Tonight, I'll guide you through a new, mysterious journey deep within the woods. The first time I heard the music come through the emergency channel, I was standing at the north-facing window of the Black Pine Lookout Tower, watching a wall of fog roll across the Cascade Range like something alive. It was 3:17 in the morning, and I had been unable to sleep for reasons I could not explain. The radio had been silent for 6 hours. Then it crackled to life with a sound that made every hair on my body stand at attention. It was a waltz. A slow, scratching waltz that sounded like it was being played on a gramophone from a century ago, broadcast through equipment that should only have been receiving official Forest Service communications and emergency distress calls. The melody was beautiful in a way that made my stomach turn, as if beauty itself had been twisted into something wrong. I stood there in the darkness of that tower, 120 feet above the forest floor, and I listened to that impossible music play for exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds before it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I have been a fire lookout ranger for the United States Forest Service for 19 years. I have spent more seasons alone in these towers than most people spend years in their own homes. I have watched lightning storms turn ancient Douglas firs into torches. I have seen black bears wander past my tower at dawn as if I were nothing more than another tree. I have heard things in the night that I have never been able to explain and have learned to file them away in that part of my mind where unexplainable things go to be forgotten. But I have never been able to forget that music. I have never been able to forget what came after. My name is Harold Eugene Whitmore, and I'm 53 years old. I was assigned to the Black Pine Lookout Tower in the northern reaches of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in the spring of 1987, though this story takes place during the summer of 1994, the season that changed everything I thought I understood about these mountains and the wilderness that surrounds them. I am writing this account by hand in a composition notebook that I keep hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my cabin in Sedro-Woolley, Washington. I do not know if anyone will ever read these words. Part of me hopes they never will. The Black Pine Lookout Tower sits at an elevation of 5,400 feet on a ridge that overlooks the Baker River drainage to the west and a seemingly endless expanse of old-growth forest to the east. On clear days, I can see the white crown of Mount Baker to the north, and on the clearest days, the distant shimmer of Puget Sound far to the west. But clear days are rare in this part of the Cascades. The fog comes in thick and fast, rolling up from the valleys like the breath of some enormous sleeping creature, and it can stay for days at a time, wrapping the tower in a gray cocoon that makes you feel as though you are the last person left on Earth. The tower itself is a standard L4 ground cab design, built in 1934 by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It is a modest structure, 14 feet by 14 feet at the top, with windows on all 4 sides and a catwalk that wraps around the exterior. Inside, there is a bed, a small wood stove, a desk with the Osborne Firefinder at its center, and the radio equipment that connects me to the outside world. Or at least, that is what the radio equipment is supposed to do. I had arrived at Black Pine on May 15th of that year, hiking the 7 miles in from the trailhead with my pack on my back, just as I had done for the previous 7 seasons. The trail winds through dense stands of western red cedar and Sitka spruce before climbing steeply through a series of switchbacks that take you above the tree line and onto the rocky spine of the ridge. By the time I reached the tower, my legs were burning and my lungs felt like they were filled with wet wool. But the sight of that tower against the pale blue sky, standing sentinel over the wilderness below, filled me with the same sense of peace and purpose that it always did. I should have known that something was different about that summer. The signs were there from the very beginning, if only I had been paying attention. The first sign came during my initial inspection of the tower. Everything appeared to be in order at first glance. The windows were intact. The roof showed no signs of damage from the winter storms, and the firefinder was in perfect working condition. But when I tested the radio, there was a strange undercurrent to the static that I had never noticed before. It was not quite a tone, not quite a rhythm, but something in between, like the ghost of a sound that had been there once and never quite left. I ran through the standard frequency checks and everything came back within normal parameters, so I dismissed the anomaly and went about the business of settling in for the season. The second sign came 2 days later when I found the journal. I was organizing the storage cabinet beneath my bunk when I discovered a leather-bound notebook wedged between the wall and the cabinet frame. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. The name written on the inside cover was Chester David Holloway, and the dates of the entries ranged from May of 1952 to August of that same year. Chester Holloway. I knew that name. Everyone who had worked the lookout towers in the northern Cascades knew that name, though most preferred not to speak it aloud. Chester Holloway was the ranger who had disappeared from the Black Pine Lookout Tower in the summer of 1952. His body was never found. The official report stated that he had likely suffered from altitude sickness or some form of mental breakdown and wandered off into the wilderness, where he presumably died of exposure. But there were other stories that the old-timers would only tell late at night after a few drinks had loosened their tongues. Stories about strange sounds in the night, about lights moving through the forest that could not be explained, about Chester Holloway himself calling out over the radio in the days after his disappearance, his voice coming through clear as day, even though the search parties could find no trace of him anywhere in the surrounding wilderness. I sat on the edge of my bunk and opened the journal with trembling hands. What I found inside would haunt me for the rest of my days. The early entries were mundane, the typical observations of a fire lookout ranger documenting the weather, the wildlife, and the slow passage of time in isolation. Chester wrote about the fog rolling in from the west, about the deer that came to drink from the snowmelt pools at dawn, about the loneliness that crept in during the long evenings when the sun took forever to set and there was nothing to do but wait for darkness to fall. He wrote about missing his wife, a woman named Dorothy, and their 2 children, a boy named Robert and a girl named Mary Ellen. He wrote about the peace he found in the solitude, even as he acknowledged that too much solitude could do strange things to a man's mind. It was in the entry dated June 23, 1952, that things began to change. I heard something on the radio last night, Chester had written. It was around 2 in the morning, and I had gotten up to relieve myself. The radio was silent, as it usually is at that hour. But then there was a burst of static and something else. Music. It sounded like music, like an old song being played far away, though I could not make out the melody clearly. It lasted only a few seconds before it was gone. I must have imagined it. The isolation plays tricks on the mind, as I well know, but it felt real. It felt terribly real. I turned the page with a growing sense of unease. The entry for June 25th was longer. I heard the music again last night, Chester had written. This time it was clearer. It was a waltz, I think, though unlike any waltz I have ever heard. There was something wrong with it, something I cannot quite put into words. The melody was beautiful, but it was a cold beauty, like the beauty of a frozen lake or a winter storm. It played for several minutes before fading back into static. I reported the anomaly to the district office this morning, but they said there were no other reports of unusual radio activity and suggested that I might be picking up a stray signal from a commercial station. But I know what commercial radio sounds like, and this was not that. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of that evening reading through Chester Holloway's journal. With each passing entry, the music became more frequent and more distinct. Chester began to describe the melody in detail, noting the way it seemed to rise and fall in patterns that did not quite follow any musical structure he recognized. He wrote about hearing voices in the static between the notes, voices that whispered things he could not quite understand but that filled him with a nameless dread. He wrote about seeing lights moving through the forest at night, pale flickering lights that seemed to dance to the rhythm of the music, though he knew that was impossible. The final entry was dated August 14, 1952. It was the shortest entry in the journal, consisting of only 3 sentences. The music is calling to me. I understand now what it wants. I am going to answer it. That was the last anyone ever heard from Chester David Holloway. I sat in the darkness of the tower for a long time after I finished reading, the journal resting on my lap, the silence pressing in around me like something physical. The fog had rolled in while I was reading, and now I could see nothing beyond the windows except an endless gray void. The isolation, which had always felt comfortable to me, suddenly felt oppressive, suffocating, like being buried alive in cotton. I told myself that Chester Holloway had simply gone mad. It happened sometimes, especially in the early days of the Lookout program, before they understood the psychological toll that extended isolation could take on a person. The music he described was nothing more than auditory hallucinations, the product of a mind that had been pushed past its breaking point. The lights he saw were probably nothing more than ball lightning or some other natural phenomenon that his fractured psyche had interpreted as something sinister. I told myself these things, but I did not believe them, because I had heard the music too. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my duties, scanning the horizons for smoke, recording weather observations, checking in with the district office twice daily as protocol required. But my mind was elsewhere, fixated on the journal hidden beneath my bunk and the questions it had raised. Who was Chester Holloway, really? What had happened to him in this tower, in this wilderness that had driven him to walk off into the forest and never return? And what was the music that we had both heard, broadcasting through a radio frequency that should have been reserved exclusively for emergency communications? I began to do research, spending my evenings poring over old Forest Service records and newspaper clippings that I had requested be sent up with my weekly supply drops. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. Chester Holloway was not the first person to disappear from the vicinity of the Black Pine Lookout Tower. He was not even the second. In the summer of 1938, a young ranger named Walter Franklin Meade had been assigned to the tower as part of a program to train new lookouts. He lasted 6 weeks before he vanished. The search parties found his boots sitting neatly at the base of the tower stairs, as if he had simply stepped out of them and walked away barefoot into the wilderness. His body was never recovered. In July of 1945, a ranger named Eugene Scott Patterson reported hearing strange sounds coming from his radio during the night watches. He described them in his reports as musical tones that seemed to have no source, though the district office dismissed his claims as the result of fatigue and overwork. Patterson completed his season at the tower, but according to the records, he never worked as a fire lookout again. He died by his own hand in the winter of 1947 in a boarding house in Everett. The newspaper article about his death mentioned that he had been found with cotton stuffed in his ears and a note that read only, "I can still hear it." There were others. A husband and wife team named Vernon and Ruth Carswell who manned the tower together in the summer of 1961. They were found wandering through the forest 3 miles from the tower, holding hands and walking in circles, both of them in a catatonic state from which they never recovered. They spent the rest of their lives in a state hospital in Tacoma, never speaking another word. A ranger named Floyd Henry Dawson who worked the tower in 1973 and who disappeared on the last night of his assignment, just hours before he was scheduled to hike out for the season. His truck was found at the trailhead the next morning with all of his belongings inside, but Floyd himself was never seen again. And now there was me, Harold Eugene Whitmore, 53 years old, 19 years of experience, sitting alone in a tower where something was very wrong and had been wrong for a very long time. I considered leaving. The thought crossed my mind more than once in those early weeks. I could radio the district office and tell them I was sick, or that I had a family emergency, or simply that I could not continue. They would send someone to replace me, and I would hike down the mountain and never look back. But something kept me there. It might have been pride, the stubborn refusal to let fear drive me from a post I had held for 7 years. It might have been curiosity, the need to understand what had happened to Chester Holloway and all the others who had come before me. Or it might have been something else entirely, something I did not want to admit even to myself. The music was calling to me, and part of me wanted to answer. The second time I heard the music was on the night of June 5th. I had finally fallen into a restless sleep sometime after midnight when the crackling of the radio woke me. I lay there in the darkness for a moment, my heart pounding, hoping that I had dreamed the sound. But then it came again, that same scratching waltz, as if someone were playing a record from another era through speakers that had never been designed for music. I got up and walked to the radio, watching the dials as if they might reveal something about the source of the transmission. The frequency indicator was firmly set to the emergency channel, just as it had been when I went to sleep. There was no logical explanation for what I was hearing. Emergency frequencies are tightly controlled. You cannot simply broadcast whatever you want on them without sophisticated equipment and a willingness to break federal law. And yet here was this music, this beautiful, terrible music, filling the tower with its impossible melody. I reached for the transmitter and keyed the microphone. "This is Black Pine Lookout," I said, my voice sounding strange and thin in the darkness. "I am receiving an unidentified transmission on the emergency frequency. Please identify yourself." There was no response. The music continued to play, unchanged, as if I had not spoken at all. I repeated my message twice more before giving up. Then I did something that I cannot fully explain, something that I still do not understand even now. I listened. I do not mean that I simply heard the music. I mean that I stopped trying to analyze it, stopped trying to find a rational explanation, and simply let it wash over me. And as I did, I began to hear things in the melody that I had not noticed before. There were layers to the music, harmonies beneath harmonies, and somewhere deep in those layers, there were voices. They were faint at first, little more than whispers buried in the scratching of the old recording, but the longer I listened, the clearer they became. They were calling names. I could not make out all of them, but some of them were familiar. Walter, Eugene, Chester, Vernon, Ruth, Floyd. Names that I had read in the old records. Names of people who had disappeared or been driven mad by this place. And then, so faint that I might have imagined it, I heard another name, Harold. The music stopped. The radio fell silent, and I stood there in the darkness of the tower, trembling from head to toe, knowing that something had changed and that nothing would ever be the same again. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I sat at my desk with all the lights on, watching the fog press against the windows, waiting for dawn to come. When the first gray light finally appeared on the eastern horizon, I was exhausted but strangely calm. I had made a decision during those long hours of darkness. I was not going to leave. I was not going to run. I was going to find out what was happening on this mountain, what had happened to all those people who had come before me, and I was going to put an end to it, or die trying. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. By daylight, I performed my duties as I always had, scanning for smoke, recording observations, maintaining the tower. But in the evenings, I became something else entirely. I became an investigator, a researcher, a man obsessed with unraveling a mystery that had claimed lives for more than half a century. I started with the journal. I read Chester Holloway's words over and over again, searching for clues that I might have missed the first time. What had he meant when he wrote that he understood what the music wanted? What answer had he gone to give? I began to map out the locations where people had disappeared or been found wandering. Using old Forest Service maps and the coordinates mentioned in the various reports, I marked each site with a pin. When I stepped back to look at the pattern that emerged, my blood ran cold. The disappearances formed a rough circle around a point approximately 3 miles to the northeast of the tower, deep in the old-growth forest where the terrain became steep and treacherous. I had hiked through that area several times over the years, but I had never noticed anything unusual about it. There was nothing there, as far as I could remember, except trees and rocks and the occasional game trail. But there had to be something. There had to be. On the morning of June 12th, I packed a day bag with supplies and set out to find it. The hike down from the tower was easy enough, following the well-worn trail that I had walked dozens of times before. But once I left the trail and struck out through the unmarked wilderness, the going became difficult. The undergrowth was thick, choked with salal and devil's club and fallen timber that forced me to climb over or around obstacles every few yards. The fog was heavy that day, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 feet, and more than once I had to stop and consult my compass to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. It took me nearly 4 hours to reach the center of the circle I had marked on my map. By the time I arrived, my legs were aching, my hands were scratched and bleeding from the devil's club thorns, and I was beginning to question whether this whole expedition had been a waste of time. The forest looked the same in every direction. Towering Douglas firs, their bark thick and deeply furrowed, rising into the fog like the columns of some ancient cathedral. There was nothing here, nothing at all. And then I saw the cabin. It emerged from the fog like a ghost, so suddenly that I nearly walked into it before I realized it was there. It was a small structure, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, built from hand-hewn logs that had gone gray with age. The roof was covered in moss so thick that the cabin seemed to be growing out of the forest floor, and the single window that faced me was dark and empty, like the eye socket of a skull. I stood there for a long moment, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to understand what I was seeing. There was no cabin marked on any of the maps I had studied. There were no records of any structure being built in this location, and yet here it was, solid and real, standing in the heart of the wilderness as if it had been here for a very long time. I approached the door slowly, half expecting it to swing open on its own, or for some figure to appear in the darkened doorway. But nothing moved. The only sound was the faint drip of condensation falling from the trees and the distant cry of a raven somewhere in the fog. The door was not locked. It was not even latched. It swung inward at my touch with a creak that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The interior of the cabin was dark, the only light coming from the open doorway behind me and the faint gray glow that filtered through the dirty window. As my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes in the gloom. There was a table in the center of the room, and on the table was something that I recognized immediately, even though I had never seen one in person before. It was a gramophone, an old Victor talking machine, the kind that had been popular in the early decades of the 20th century, with a large brass horn and a hand crank on the side. Sitting on the turntable was a record, its surface so worn and scratched that I could barely make out the label. But I could read enough to see that there was no song title, no artist name, no record company. There was only a single word, handwritten in faded ink. Listen. I do not know how long I stood there, staring at that gramophone in the dim light of the abandoned cabin. It might have been seconds. It might have been hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that place, as if the cabin existed outside of normal reality, in some pocket of the world where the usual rules did not apply. Finally, I forced myself to move. I walked around the table, examining the gramophone from every angle, looking for some clue as to how it had come to be here and what it meant. The machine was old, that much was obvious, but it was also in remarkably good condition. There was no dust on the brass horn, no cobwebs in the crank mechanism. It looked as though someone had been maintaining it, keeping it ready for use, even though the cabin showed no other signs of recent habitation. I should not have done what I did next. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get out of that cabin and never come back. But something compelled me to stay, to reach out and place my hand on the crank. I turned it, once, twice, 3 times. The mechanism wound with a smooth, well-oiled sound that seemed out of place in that decaying cabin. And then I placed the needle on the record. The sound that came from the horn was the same music I had heard on the radio, the same slow waltz that had haunted my night since I arrived at the tower. But here, in this cabin, it was different. Louder, clearer, more present, as if the music were not simply being played, but being conjured, brought into existence by the act of listening. And the voices. Oh God, the voices. They were not whispers anymore. They were speaking, all of them speaking at once, their words overlapping and intertwining in a way that should have been cacophonous, but was somehow harmonious, as if their speech were part of the music itself. I could not understand most of what they were saying, but fragments came through clear as day. Come to us. We are waiting. The forest is hungry. Join us in the dance. I ripped the needle from the record. The music stopped instantly, leaving a silence that was almost worse than the sound had been. I stood there, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had to destroy this thing. The gramophone was the source of everything that had happened on this mountain, the disappearances, the madness, all of it. If I smashed it to pieces, maybe the horror would finally end. I picked up the machine, ready to hurl it against the wall, when I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a name carved into the wooden base of the gramophone, scratched into the varnish with what looked like a knife or a sharp rock. Chester David Holloway, 1952. Chester had been here. Chester had found this cabin, just as I had. And Chester had not destroyed the gramophone. Chester had done something else entirely. I set the machine down and looked around the cabin with new eyes. In the far corner, half hidden by shadows, I saw something I had missed before. A small mound of earth roughly the size and shape of a human body, covered with a layer of dead leaves and forest debris. I did not have a shovel. I did not have any tools at all. But I had my hands, and I used them, clawing away the dirt and leaves with a frantic energy that I did not know I possessed. The soil was soft and damp, easy to move, and within minutes I had uncovered what lay beneath. It was a skeleton, human by the size and shape of the bones. It was lying on its back with its arms crossed over its chest, and on its left hand there was a ring, a simple gold band that had somehow escaped the corrosion of decades in the earth. I reached down and gently removed the ring. On the inside, worn but still legible, was an inscription, to Chester, from Dorothy, forever. I had found Chester Holloway, or what was left of him. I do not remember the hike back to the tower. I must have made it, because the next thing I recall is sitting at my desk with the ring in my hand and the journal open in front of me, reading Chester's final words over and over again. The music is calling to me. I understand now what it wants. I am going to answer it. He had gone to the cabin. He had found the gramophone just as I had. But instead of destroying it, instead of running, he had done something else. He had stayed. He had listened. And the forest had taken him. But why? What was the music? Where did it come from? And why did it want us? I spent the next several weeks searching for answers. I requested more records from the district office, reaching back even further into the history of the region. I wrote letters to historians and folklorists at the university in Seattle, asking about local legends and indigenous beliefs about this part of the mountains. Most of my inquiries went unanswered, but a few came back with information that added new dimensions to the mystery. A professor of anthropology named Dr. Margaret Ellen Sutherland replied to my letter with a long and detailed response. She wrote that the indigenous peoples of the region, the Nooksack and the Upper Skagit, had stories about this part of the mountains that dated back centuries. They spoke of a place in the forest where the veil between worlds was thin, where spirits could cross over into the realm of the living if they were called by the right songs. The tribes had avoided this area, considering it taboo, a place where even the bravest hunters would not go. Dr. Sutherland also mentioned something else, something that made my blood freeze in my veins. She wrote that according to some versions of the stories, the spirits of the place were not malevolent by nature. They were lonely. They had been separated from the world of the living for so long that they had forgotten how to exist without human company. They called out to people trying to draw them into the forest, not to harm them, but to keep them, to hold on to them forever in a realm where time had no meaning, and death was not an ending, but a transformation. The music was a summoning. The gramophone was a doorway, and everyone who had heard the call and answered it had become part of the forest, their spirits joining the chorus that called out to new victims. I should have been terrified. Part of me was. But another part of me felt something else entirely. Pity. These were not demons or monsters. They were lost souls, trapped between worlds, reaching out for the only connection they could still feel. They did not want to hurt anyone. They just did not want to be alone. It did not make what they were doing any less horrifying. It did not bring back Chester Holloway or Walter Mead or any of the others who had been taken, but it helped me understand what I was dealing with. And understanding, I have always believed, is the first step toward finding a solution. The music came more frequently now, every few nights without fail. I learned to recognize its approach, the way the static on the radio would begin to shift and pulse just before the melody emerged. I learned to brace myself for the voices, for the names that were called out in the darkness. My name was among them every time. Harold, Harold, come to us, Harold, repeated like a prayer or an invitation. I never answered. I never spoke back, but I also never turned off the radio. Part of me believed that as long as I was listening, as long as I was aware of what was happening, I could resist the call. The others had not known what they were facing. They had gone to the cabin in confusion or desperation, seeking answers that they could not find. I knew the truth now, and knowledge, I hoped, would be my shield. The summer wore on. June became July, and July became August. The fire season was mild that year, with only a few small lightning strikes that the ground crews handled before they could spread. My reports to the district office were routine, even boring. On paper, it was a perfectly normal season for the Black Pine Lookout Tower. But nothing was normal. Not anymore. The fog came and went, sometimes lifting to reveal stunning views of the mountains and valleys, sometimes pressing in so thick that I could not see the ground below the tower. On the clear nights, I would stand on the catwalk and look out at the vast darkness of the forest, trying to imagine all the lost souls wandering somewhere beneath the canopy, dancing to music that only they could hear. On the foggy nights, I would stay inside with the lights on, listening to the radio crackle and waiting for the waltz to begin. I began to hear other things too, sounds that came from the forest itself, not from the radio. Footsteps on the stairs of the tower in the middle of the night, climbing up toward my room and then stopping just outside the door. Whispers that seemed to come from just beyond the windows, too faint to make out but clearly human in origin. Once, I looked out the north window and saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, a man-shaped shadow that did not move, did not react when I shone my flashlight at it, but simply stood there for hours until the dawn came and the light revealed nothing but empty forest. I was being watched. I was being tested. The spirits of the forest were trying to determine whether I would break, whether the fear and isolation would drive me to seek them out. just as it had driven so many others before me. I refused to give them the satisfaction. On the night of August 23rd, something changed. The music came through the radio as usual, but this time it was different. The waltz was faster, more urgent, and the voices were louder than they had ever been. They were not just calling names anymore. They were speaking in sentences, in paragraphs, their words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush that made my head spin. "He is coming," they said. "The one who made us. He is coming back at last." I did not understand what they meant. I did not know who the one who made us could be. But the fear in their voices was unmistakable. Whatever was coming, it scared them. And if something could scare the spirits that had haunted this mountain for decades, then it was something that should terrify me as well. The music stopped abruptly, cut off in mid-note as if someone had yanked the needle from the record. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than any silence I had ever experienced. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, even the insects and night birds that usually provided a constant background chorus. The world was holding its breath, and then I heard it. A sound from the forest below, distant but growing closer. It was not music, not voices, not any sound I could identify. It was a presence, a weight in the air, a feeling of something massive and ancient moving through the trees. I turned off all the lights in the tower and crouched beneath the windows, my heart pounding so hard that I could barely hear anything else. I do not know what I expected to see. A creature, perhaps. Some nightmarish thing from the oldest parts of human imagination. Or a man, a figure from history, someone whose identity would explain everything that had happened in this place. What I saw was neither. There was a light moving through the forest. Not the pale, flickering lights that I had seen before. The ones that seemed to dance with the music. This was something different. It was a cold blue-white glow, like moonlight concentrated into a single point, and it was moving with purpose, cutting a path through the trees in a direction that I recognized immediately, was heading toward the cabin, toward the gramophone. I watched the light until it disappeared into the fog, and then I sat in the darkness for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Every rational part of my mind told me to stay in the tower, to wait until morning, to report what I had seen to the district office, and let someone else deal with whatever was happening out there. But another part of me, a part that I was only beginning to understand, knew that this was the moment I had been waiting for. The answers I had been seeking were out there in the forest, and if I did not go now, I might never get another chance. I grabbed my flashlight, my compass, and the small knife I kept for cutting rope and branches. Then I descended the stairs of the tower and stepped out into the night. The fog was thick, thicker than I had ever seen it. My flashlight barely penetrated more than a few feet, creating a small bubble of light that moved with me as I walked. The forest was utterly silent. No wind, no animals, no insects. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the rapid beating of my heart. I had memorized the route to the cabin during my first visit, and even in the fog, I was able to follow it with reasonable accuracy. The going was slow, much slower than it had been in daylight, and several times I had to stop and consult my compass to make sure I was still on course. But finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably no more than 2, I saw the faint outline of the cabin emerge from the gray. The blue-white light was coming from inside. I approached the door slowly, my flashlight off now, moving by feel and instinct. The door was standing open, just as I had left it all those weeks ago, and the light spilling out created a rectangle of illumination on the forest floor. I pressed my back against the wall and edged toward the opening, straining to hear any sound from within. There was no music, no voices, just that cold, steady glow and a silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like a physical force. I took a deep breath, stepped into the doorway, and looked inside. The cabin was transformed. The gramophone was still there on the table, but it was no longer still. The turntable was spinning, the record rotating beneath a needle that was not touching its surface, moving on its own without any hand to guide it. And standing behind the gramophone, bathed in that unearthly blue-white light, was a figure. It was a man, or something that had once been a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in clothing that might have been fashionable 100 years ago, a long coat and a high collar and boots that came up to his knees. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were the source of the light, 2 points of cold fire that seemed to look right through me. He spoke, and his voice was like the music, beautiful and terrible and wrong. "You have been listening," he said. "You have heard the call. Why do you not answer?" I could not speak. I could not move. I stood there in the doorway, frozen, as the figure regarded me with those burning eyes. "They are mine," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the air around him. "All of them. Every soul that has walked into this forest and heard my music. They belong to me now. They dance for me in the spaces between worlds. They sing for me in the silence of eternity. And soon, you will join them." I found my voice at last. It came out as a croak, barely recognizable as human speech. "Who are you?" The figure smiled, and there was nothing human in that smile. "I was the first," he said. "The first to find this place. The first to understand its power. The first to step through the door and become something more than mortal." He moved toward me, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the threshold. "This forest is old," he said. "Older than your nation. Older than the people who lived here before you. It was waiting for someone like me. Someone who could hear its voice. Someone who could sing its songs. And when I found the way to cross over, it became mine. This cabin. This machine. This door between worlds. All of it. Mine." I kept backing away, out of the cabin, into the fog-shrouded forest. The figure followed, his light casting long shadows through the trees. "I do not take them against their will," he said. "I only call to them. I only invite. They choose to come to me. They choose to stay. The music is a gift. The dance is freedom. Why do you resist?" "Because I want to live," I said. "Because I have seen what happens to the people who answer your call. They disappear. They die. They become nothing more than whispers in the dark." The figure stopped, and for a moment, something flickered in those burning eyes. Sadness, perhaps, or something like it. "You do not understand," he said. "They do not die. They become part of something greater, something eternal. The forest does not kill. It transforms. It welcomes. It loves." I shook my head. "I have read their stories. Chester Holloway, Walter Mead, all the others. They were not looking for transformation. They were not seeking eternity. They were just trying to do their jobs, trying to live their lives, and your music drove them mad. Your voice led them into the forest to die. That is not love. That is hunger." The figure was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke again, and his voice was different now, softer, almost human. "You may be right," he said. "I have been alone for so long. The years blur together. The centuries become moments. I have forgotten what it was to be mortal, forgotten what it meant to fear death instead of embracing it. Perhaps I have been selfish. Perhaps I have been cruel." He looked at me, and for just an instant, I saw the man he had once been. A settler, perhaps, or an explorer, someone who had wandered into this wilderness a long time ago and found something that he should have left alone. "But I cannot stop now," he said, and the coldness returned to his voice. "The music must be heard. The dance must continue. The forest has become part of me, and I have become part of it. There is no separation anymore, no going back." He raised his hand, and the air around me seemed to thicken, to press in, to hold me in place. "You have listened to the music, Harold Eugene Whitmore. You have heard the call. You cannot unhear it. Sooner or later you will answer. They all answer, in the end." "No," I said. "I will not." The figure smiled that inhuman smile. "We shall see." And then he was gone. The light vanished, the pressure released. I was standing alone in the fog-shrouded forest, with nothing but the darkness and the silence and the distant shape of the cabin behind me. I ran. I ran all the way back to the tower, crashing through underbrush, tripping over roots, not caring about the noise I was making or the branches that tore at my clothes and skin. By the time I reached the stairs, I was bleeding from a dozen cuts and my lungs were burning, but I did not stop until I was inside the cabin with the door locked behind me. I sat there until dawn, watching the fog slowly lift, waiting for the sun to rise and chase away the shadows. The radio was silent. The forest was silent. But I knew that the silence was only temporary. The music would come again. The voice would call again. And I would have to decide whether to answer. The rest of that season passed in a blur of tension and fear. I continued my duties, continued my reports, continued the routine that had defined my life for nearly 2 decades. But nothing was the same. Every crackle of the radio made me jump. Every shadow in the forest made me reach for my knife. Every night, I lay awake in my bunk, listening for the waltz to begin, dreading the moment when I would hear my name called from the darkness. The music came, as it always did, but it seemed different now, softer, more plaintive, less like a summons and more like a lament. The voices still called to me, but there was a sadness in them that I had not noticed before. They were lost souls, I reminded myself. They were lonely, they were trapped, and the thing that held them, the man who had once been mortal and had become something else, was trapped too. I began to pity him. I know how strange that sounds. I know how dangerous it is to feel sympathy for the thing that wants to destroy you. But I could not help it. He had been human once. He had wandered into this forest looking for something, adventure or escape or just a place to belong, and he had found more than he bargained for. The forest had taken him, transformed him, made him into something that could never leave. And now he spent eternity calling out to others, trying to ease his loneliness, unable to understand why they feared him, unable to stop the hunger that drove him to consume every soul that came within reach. It did not make him less dangerous. It did not make me less afraid, but it made me understand him in a way that I had not before. September came, and with it, the end of the fire season. On the morning of September 15th, I made my final radio check, locked up the tower, and began the long hike down to the trailhead. The forest was beautiful that day, the fog burned off by a warm autumn sun, the leaves just beginning to turn from green to gold. I walked slowly, savoring each step, knowing that it might be the last time I ever saw this place. Because I had made a decision, I was not coming back. I submitted my resignation from the Forest Service that winter. I told them that I was getting too old for the isolation, that my joints ached in the cold, that I wanted to spend my remaining years somewhere with people around me. They accepted without question. I was not the first ranger to burn out after too many seasons in the lookout towers, but I did not burn out. I did not run because I was tired or lonely or afraid of growing old alone. I ran because I knew that if I stayed, if I went back to that tower one more time, I would eventually answer the call. The music was inside me now. I could hear it sometimes, late at night, when the wind was still and the silence was absolute. A faint melody, barely there, just on the edge of hearing. A waltz that played in my dreams and whispered promises of eternity. The figure in the cabin had been right. You cannot unhear the music. You cannot unfeel the pull. Once you have heard the call, it stays with you forever, waiting for a moment of weakness, a night when the loneliness becomes too much, a time when the promise of never being alone again seems worth the price. I have resisted for 30 years now. I live in Sedro-Woolley, in a small cabin of my own, surrounded by neighbors and noise and all the comforting bustle of ordinary human life. I do not go into the wilderness anymore. I do not listen to waltz music. I keep the radio off after sunset, every sunset, without exception. But sometimes, on the foggiest nights, when the clouds come down so thick that I cannot see the streetlights from my window, I still hear it. That scratching melody, those whispering voices. My name called from somewhere far away but coming closer. Harold. Harold. Come to us, Harold. The dance is waiting. The song is playing. The forest is calling. I do not know how much longer I can hold out. I am 83 years old now, and my body is failing me. The doctors say I have maybe a year left, maybe less. Soon, I will have to choose how I want to die. In a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and strangers, or in the forest, dancing to music that no one else can hear, joining the chorus of lost souls that have been calling to me for 3 decades. I have not decided yet. Part of me still wants to resist. Part of me still believes that death should be an ending, not a transformation. But another part of me, a part that grows stronger with each passing day, wonders what it would be like to finally answer the call, to step through the door that Chester Holloway and Walter Mead and all the others stepped through, to become part of the forest, part of the music, part of something that will endure long after the world of men has turned to dust. The music is playing. It is always playing, for those who know how to listen. I think I will wait until the fog comes again, and then, maybe, I will finally dance. This account was found in the cabin of Harold Eugene Whitmore in Sedro-Woolley, Washington, following his disappearance on October 3rd of this year. His body has not been recovered. Search parties have reported hearing strange sounds in the mountains, sounds that one ranger described as music, though no source has been identified. The Black Pine Lookout Tower remains in operation. A new ranger will be assigned next spring. If you are reading this, please, do not go there. Do not listen to the music. Do not answer the call. The forest is hungry, and it is patient. It has been waiting for a very long time. It can wait a little longer. The days after I wrote those words in my composition notebook were strange ones. I had intended the account to serve as a warning, a record that might help others understand what was happening in those mountains, even if I was no longer around to explain it myself. But putting the experience into words had an unexpected effect on me. It made everything more real, more immediate, more impossible to ignore. I had been living in a kind of denial for 3 decades, telling myself that the memories were fading, that the music was growing quieter, that I had successfully escaped the pull of the forest. But writing the story down forced me to confront the truth. The music had never stopped. The voices had never gone silent. I had simply learned to push them to the back of my mind, to fill my days with enough noise and activity to drown out the whispers. And now that I had acknowledged them, now that I had given them form and substance on the page, they were louder than ever. I began to hear the waltz even in daylight. It would creep into the quiet moments, the gaps between conversations, the spaces where the ordinary sounds of life did not quite reach. I would be sitting in my chair, reading the newspaper, and suddenly the melody would be there, faint but unmistakable, as if someone were playing a gramophone in the next room. I would go to check, and of course there would be nothing. Just empty rooms and silence and the pounding of my own heart. The dreams came back too. I had not dreamed of the forest in years, had trained myself to think of other things before sleep, to fill my mind with mundane images that left no room for the darkness. But now, every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that mountain. Back in that tower, back in that cabin, standing before the gramophone, watching the record spin in the cold blue light. And there was something new in the dreams, something that had not been there before. A door. It was always the same. I would be standing in the cabin, and the music would be playing, and the voices would be calling my name, and then I would notice that the wall behind the gramophone was different. There was a door there now, a simple wooden door that looked as old as the cabin itself. It had no handle, no hinges that I could see, just a smooth surface with a faint light glowing around the edges. In the dreams, I always walked toward the door. I always reached out my hand to touch it. And every time, just before my fingers made contact with the wood, I would wake up with a gasp, my body drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the echo of the music still ringing in my ears. I knew what the door was. I knew where it led. It was the threshold that the figure had spoken of, the boundary between this world and whatever lay beyond, the place where the spirits danced, the realm where time had no meaning and death was just another kind of becoming. The door was open now, and it was waiting for me to step through. I tried to resist. I threw myself into the routines of daily life with a desperation that probably looked like madness to my neighbors. I went to church every Sunday, sat in the back pew, and let the hymns and prayers wash over me like a cleansing tide. I volunteered at the community center, helping with the meals for the elderly, keeping my hands busy and my mind focused on the present moment. I called my sister in Portland every night, talked about nothing important for hours at a time, just to hear another human voice. But none of it was enough. The music was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness, and I was growing weaker by the day. My doctor noticed the change during my October checkup. He asked if I was sleeping well, if I was eating properly, if there was anything troubling me. I told him I was fine, just the usual aches and pains of old age. He did not believe me. I could see it in his eyes. But what could I tell him? That I was being haunted by a supernatural entity that had been calling to me for 30 years? That I could hear music coming from the walls of my cabin, music that no one else could hear? That I was afraid to fall asleep because I knew the door would be waiting for me. He would have had me committed, and maybe that would have been for the best. The final change came on the night of September 28th. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from another day of fighting against the pull, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The dream began as it always did, with me standing in the cabin, the gramophone spinning, the music playing. But this time, when I looked at the door, it was open. Not all the way, just a crack. but it was enough to see what lay beyond. Light, a soft, warm light like sunlight filtering through leaves. And movement, figures dancing, spinning, their shapes blurred but unmistakably human. I could hear them laughing, a sound of pure joy that cut through the melody of the waltz like a counterpoint. They were happy. They were free. They were together, all of them, all the lost souls who had answered the call over the years, dancing in a realm where loneliness did not exist. And standing among them, smiling at me, was Chester Holloway. I recognized him immediately, even though I had never seen a photograph, even though he had been dead for more than 40 years. He was young again, or perhaps he had never been old, his face unlined, his eyes bright with a light that was not the cold fire of the figure in the cabin, but something warmer, something gentler. He raised his hand and waved at me, a simple gesture of welcome, of invitation. "Come," he seemed to say. "It is not what you feared. It is better, so much better." I woke up crying, not from fear, from longing. I understood, in that moment, what Chester had understood all those years ago. The music was not a trap. It was not a lure designed to drag unsuspecting souls into some nightmare realm of suffering and despair. It was exactly what the figure had said it was, an invitation, a gift, a door to a place where the loneliness of mortal existence could finally come to an end. The figure himself was not evil. He was simply the first, the one who had discovered the secret of the forest and had spent centuries trying to share it with others. His methods were clumsy, his approach frightening, because he had forgotten what it was to be human, had forgotten that mortals feared the unknown even when the unknown was something wonderful. But his intentions had never been malicious. He was just lonely. They were all lonely, and they wanted company in the endless dance. I am not saying this to excuse what happened to Walter Mead and Eugene Patterson and all the others. Their deaths were tragedies, the result of a misunderstanding that had persisted for far too long. They came to the forest looking for answers and found only terror because they did not understand what they were being offered. They fought against the call instead of surrendering to it. And that resistance, that fear, was what destroyed them. But I understood now. I knew the truth, and I was no longer afraid. On the morning of October 3rd, I made my preparations. I wrote a letter to my sister, telling her that I loved her and that I was not sorry for the choice I was about to make. I arranged my affairs, made sure that my bills were paid and my belongings were in order. And then I drove to the trailhead at the base of the mountain where the Black Pine Lookout Tower stood sentinel over the forest. The hike was harder than I remembered. My body was old, my lungs weak, my legs unsteady on the uneven ground. But I pressed on, driven by a determination that went beyond mere physical endurance. I had waited 30 years for this moment. I was not going to let a few tired muscles stop me now. I did not go to the tower. I went directly to the cabin, following the route that was burned into my memory even after all these years. The forest seemed to welcome me, the fog parting to let me pass, the undergrowth bending aside as if pushed by invisible hands. The animals watched me go, deer and rabbits and birds, all of them silent, all of them still, as if they knew that something important was about to happen. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it. The logs gray with age, the moss thick on the roof, the single window dark and empty, the door standing open, waiting. I walked inside. The gramophone was there. The record was spinning, just as it had been in my dreams. The music was playing, that beautiful, terrible waltz, and the voices were singing, calling my name, welcoming me home. And the door was there too, in the wall behind the gramophone, open wide now. Not just a crack, but all the way, revealing the light and the dancers and the smiling face of Chester Holloway beckoning me forward. I did not hesitate. I did not look back. I walked through the door. What I found on the other side is difficult to describe in words. Language was made for the world I left behind, for the solid, limited realm of matter and time. The place I entered operated by different rules. Rules that my human mind struggled to comprehend even as I experienced them. There was no ground beneath my feet, but I did not fall. There was no sky above my head, but I could see for miles in every direction. The light was everywhere and nowhere, warm and cool at the same time, coming from a source that I could not identify but that seemed to be part of everything around me. And there were people, Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving through the light like dancers at a ball. They were all ages, all types, men and women and children, some dressed in clothing from decades past, some in styles that I did not recognize. They were holding hands, spinning in circles, their faces lit with joy. Chester Holloway came toward me, his smile wider than ever. "You made it," he said, and his voice was like the music, beautiful and strange and full of something that I can only call love. "I knew you would. I knew you had the courage." I looked around at the dancers, at the light, at the vast and impossible space that surrounded us. "Is this real?" I asked. Chester laughed. "More real than anything in the world you left behind. That world is the dream, Harold. This is the waking. This is the truth." He took my hand and pulled me forward, into the dance. And I danced. I danced with Chester and with Walter and with all the others who had answered the call before me. I danced with a figure who had once been mortal, and I saw that he was no longer cold, no longer frightening, but just another soul in the endless celebration. I danced until time lost all meaning, until the memories of my old life faded to shadows, until all that remained was the music and the movement and the overwhelming, indescribable joy. I am still dancing now. I will be dancing forever. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in over the mountains and the world grows quiet and still, I reach back through the door and sing with the others. We call to the living, to the lonely, to the ones who sit alone in their towers and wonder if there is something more. We do not mean to frighten them. We only want to share what we have found. The music is playing. It is always playing. Listen, can you hear it? The file recovered from the Whitmore cabin contained 347 handwritten pages, the final 50 of which appeared to have been written in a different hand than the rest. Forensic analysis has been unable to identify the author of these concluding sections. Harold Eugene Whitmore was officially declared missing on October 5th and presumed dead on October 10th. No body was recovered. Search and rescue teams combed the wilderness for 3 weeks, focusing on the area around the Black Pine Lookout Tower, but found no trace of Whitmore or any evidence of where he might have gone. The cabin described in the narrative has not been located. Multiple expeditions have searched the coordinates indicated in Whitmore's notes, but the terrain is dense and heavily forested, and visibility is often reduced to near zero by fog. Some members of the search teams reported hearing unusual sounds during their searches, sounds that one ranger described as music, though no source was ever identified. The gramophone has not been found. In the spring of the following year, a new ranger was assigned to the Black Pine Lookout Tower. Her name was Eleanor Frances Mitchell, and she was 27 years old. She had worked for the Forest Service for 3 years and had requested a posting in the North Cascades specifically because of her love for the wilderness and her desire for solitude. Eleanor lasted 6 weeks in the tower before she began filing reports about unusual radio activity. The reports described a strange musical tone that came through the emergency channel at irregular intervals, usually between 2 and 4 in the morning. Eleanor wrote that the tone sounded like an old recording, scratchy and distorted, but that there was something beautiful about it, something that made her want to listen even when she knew she should turn the radio off. The district office sent a technician to examine the radio equipment. He found nothing wrong with it. The equipment was functioning exactly as it should. Eleanor's final report was filed on July 14th. In it, she wrote that she had been hearing voices in the music, voices that called her name, voices that promised her something wonderful if she would just come and find them. She disappeared on July 15th. Her body has never been found. The Black Pine Lookout Tower was officially decommissioned the following year. The Forest Service cited budget constraints and changing fire detection methods. But there were rumors among the rangers that the real reason was something else, something that no one wanted to talk about. The tower still stands today, abandoned and slowly decaying, its windows broken, its catwalk rusting. Hikers sometimes make the trek up to see it, attracted by the spectacular views and the sense of history. Most of them report nothing unusual, but every so often, a hiker will come back down from the mountain with a strange look in their eyes. They will talk about hearing something up there. A faint sound carried on the wind, something that sounded almost like music. They will say that they felt drawn to stay, to climb up into the tower and sit in the darkness and just listen. When asked why they did not stay, they usually cannot explain. They just say that something told them to leave, something deep inside them that recognized the danger even when their conscious minds could not. Something that remembered an old story, half heard and half forgotten, about a fire lookout ranger who disappeared in the mountains and the music that came through his radio late at night. The music is still playing, up there in the mountains, deep in the forest, beyond the door that leads to somewhere else. And if you ever find yourself alone on a foggy night, standing at the edge of the wilderness, and you hear a faint melody drifting through the trees, a slow waltz that sounds like it is being played on a gramophone from another era, please, I am begging you, do not listen, do not follow, do not answer the call. Because once you hear the music, really hear it, there is no going back. It will stay with you forever. It will whisper to you in the quiet moments. It will call your name in the darkness. And one day, when you are tired and lonely and ready for something more, you will find yourself walking into the forest, following a path that you do not remember choosing, heading toward a cabin that does not appear on any map. The door will be open. The gramophone will be spinning, the dancers will be waiting, and you will take their hands and join them, and you will dance forever. This is the end of the account of Harold Eugene Whitmore. This is the beginning of the silence. Listen, the music is playing. Can you hear it? The investigation into the disappearances at the Black Pine Lookout Tower was officially closed in the autumn of 1996, nearly 2 years after Harold Whitmore vanished into the wilderness. The file was classified as unsolved, the conclusion stating that Whitmore and the subsequent disappearance of Eleanor Mitchell were likely the result of misadventure in hazardous terrain. The mountains of the North Cascades had claimed lives before. They would claim lives again. There was nothing supernatural about it. But the file remained incomplete. Questions lingered. Shadows gathered at the edges of the official narrative like storm clouds on a distant horizon. I know this because I have read the file. I have seen the reports, the photographs, the carefully redacted sections where someone decided that certain information was best kept hidden. I have held the composition notebook that was found in Harold Whitmore's cabin, have run my fingers over the pages where his handwriting gradually deteriorated from the careful script of a trained observer to something wild and desperate and barely legible. I have traced the final words he wrote before the account was continued by that other unknown hand. I know all of this because I am the ranger who found his cabin. I am the one who opened the notebook and began to read. And I am the one who cannot stop thinking about what I discovered inside. My name is Margaret Ellen Crawford. I am 41 years old. I have worked for the United States Forest Service for 18 years, the last 5 of them as a district ranger overseeing operations in the North Cascades. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not believe in supernatural phenomena. I am a practical woman, trained in science and observation, dedicated to the preservation and protection of our national forests. But I have heard the music. It happened 3 months ago, during a routine inspection of the decommissioned fire lookout towers in my district. The Black Pine Tower was on my list, one of 7 structures I was scheduled to evaluate for potential restoration or demolition. It was supposed to be a simple visit. Take some photographs, assess the structural integrity, write a report, move on. The hike up to the tower took most of the day. The trail had become overgrown in the years since the tower was abandoned, choked with salal and devil's club that tore at my clothing and skin. By the time I reached the ridge, I was exhausted and irritable and ready to make my assessment as quickly as possible so I could begin the long trek back before nightfall. The tower was in worse condition than I had expected. The windows were mostly broken. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The catwalk was rusted through in several places, obviously unsafe for walking. It was clear that the structure was beyond repair and would need to be demolished before it became a hazard to hikers who might be tempted to explore it. I took my photographs. I made my notes. I was about to begin my descent when something caught my eye. There was a glint of metal on the floor inside the tower, visible through the broken windows. It looked like it might be an old piece of equipment, something left behind when the tower was decommissioned. I told myself that I should leave it alone, that there was nothing inside that tower worth risking my safety for. But curiosity got the better of me, as it so often does. The door opened with a screech of protesting hinges. The interior was dark, lit only by the gray light filtering through the broken windows. I swept my flashlight across the room and saw the standard furnishings of an abandoned lookout, a rusted bed frame, a collapsed desk, an Osborne firefinder that had been stripped of its more valuable components. And on the floor, half hidden beneath debris, a radio. It was an old model, the kind that had been used by Forest Service lookouts in the 1970s and 1980s. It was corroded and damaged, obviously non-functional, but something about it made me pick it up, made me wipe away the dirt and examine it more closely. There was a label on the back, hand-lettered in faded ink. Property of H.E. Whitmore. I stood there in the darkness of that ruined tower, holding the radio that had belonged to a man who had disappeared 30 years ago, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I took the radio with me when I left. I do not know why. It was old and broken and had no practical value. But something told me that it was important. Something told me that I needed to understand. That night, back in my cabin at the district headquarters, I did not sleep. I sat at my desk with the radio in front of me, turning it over in my hands, trying to figure out why it felt so significant. And somewhere around 3 a.m, when the silence had grown so deep that it seemed to press against my eardrums, I heard something. Music, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere that I could not identify. It was a waltz. I searched my cabin from top to bottom, looking for the source. I checked my phone, my computer, the old clock radio on my nightstand. Nothing was playing, nothing was on. But the music continued, rising and falling in patterns that seemed to follow rules I did not understand. And then I heard the voices. They were whispering, just as Harold Whitmore had described. Whispering names. And among those names, I heard my own. Margaret. Margaret. Come to us, Margaret. I did not answer. I covered my ears and waited for the sound to stop. And eventually, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, it did. The silence returned. The night was normal again. But I knew that something had changed. Something had been set in motion that I could not stop. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with the story of the Black Pine Lookout Tower. I read every file, every report, every scrap of information I could find. I tracked down the notebook that had been recovered from Harold Whitmore's cabin and spent long nights reading his account, searching for clues, trying to understand what had really happened on that mountain. The more I learned, the more questions I had. Who had built the cabin in the forest, the one with the gramophone? When had it been built, and by whom? How had Harold Whitmore found it when it did not appear on any map? Who was the figure he had encountered, the one who claimed to be the first to discover the secret of the forest? Where had he come from, and what had made him into the thing he had become? And most importantly, were the spirits of the lost really dancing in some realm beyond our own, or had they simply died, their bodies consumed by the wilderness, their stories twisted by a mind that had been pushed past its breaking point? I did not know. I still do not know. The evidence points in both directions, toward the supernatural and toward the mundane, and I am unable to determine which interpretation is correct. But I can tell you this, the music is real. I have heard it twice more since that night in my cabin. Once while driving through the mountains at dusk, when the radio in my truck suddenly picked up a signal that should not have been there, and once while hiking alone near the boundary of the wilderness area, when the wind seemed to carry a melody that rose and fell like the breathing of some enormous creature. Each time, I have resisted the urge to follow. Each time, I have turned away, have gotten back in my truck or retraced my steps along the trail, have put as much distance as possible between myself and the source of that impossible sound. But I can feel the pull growing stronger. I can feel the call becoming harder to ignore. Harold Whitmore wrote that the music stays with you once you hear it, that it whispers to you in the quiet moments, that it will eventually lead you into the forest, whether you want to go or not. I did not believe him when I first read those words. I thought he was describing the delusions of a disturbed mind, the fantasies of a man who had spent too many years alone in the wilderness. I believe him now. I do not know how much longer I can resist. The music is always there, just beneath the surface of my consciousness, waiting for a moment of weakness. It calls to me in my dreams. It whispers to me when I wake in the middle of the night. It promises me things, wonderful things, things that I want more than I have ever wanted anything. It promises me that I will never be alone again. I am writing this account as a warning, a continuation of the work that Harold Whitmore began and that has now been passed to me. I am writing it because someone needs to know the truth about what is happening in the mountains of the North Cascades, about the secret that has been hidden there for more than a century. about the door that opens onto something beyond our understanding. I am writing it because I am afraid. Not of death. Not of what lies beyond the threshold. I am afraid because I am beginning to want it. I am beginning to hope that the music is real, that the dancing spirits are real, that there is a place where the loneliness of mortal existence can finally come to an end, and I'm afraid of what that wanting might make me do. If you are reading this, please understand. The danger is real. The forest is hungry. The music is calling, and sooner or later, if you hear it, you will answer. Stay away from the Black Pine Lookout Tower. Stay away from the wilderness areas of the North Cascades. If you ever find yourself hiking through those mountains and you hear something that sounds like music, like an old waltz being played on a gramophone from another era, turn around immediately. Walk back the way you came. Do not stop. Do not listen. Do not let the melody take root in your mind, because once it does, there is no going back. The music is playing. It has been playing for a very long time, and it will continue to play long after you and I and everyone we know is turned to dust. The forest is patient. The dance is eternal. The door is always open. And somewhere out there, in the spaces between the trees, in the fog that rolls across the mountains like the breath of something ancient and hungry, the lost souls are waiting. They are waiting for you. This document was discovered in the cabin of District Ranger Margaret Ellen Crawford on December 17th of this year, following her disappearance. She was last seen on December 15th, leaving the district headquarters in the early morning hours. Her vehicle was found at the trailhead leading to the Black Pine Lookout Tower. No footprints or other tracks were visible in the snow. Search and rescue teams have been dispatched to the area. As of this writing, no trace of Ranger Crawford has been found. The forest is quiet today. The fog has lifted. The sun is shining on the snow-covered peaks of the Cascade Range. But somewhere up there, in the ruins of an abandoned fire lookout tower, in the depths of a wilderness that has kept its secrets for longer than anyone can remember, the music is playing. Can you hear it? Can you? The final document in the Black Pine file is a single sheet of paper, folded in quarters, discovered by a maintenance worker in the district headquarters building 3 days after Margaret Crawford's disappearance. It was found wedged between the desk and the wall in her office, as if it had fallen there by accident. The handwriting does not match Crawford's. It reads, "We have her now. She is dancing with us. She is happy. The door is still open. More will come. They always come. The music is patient. The forest is forever. Do not look for her. Do not look for any of us. We are beyond finding now. We are beyond everything, but we are not gone. We are here. We are always here. Listen. You can hear us if you try. Listen to the wind. Listen to the silence. Listen to the space between heartbeats. We are there. We are waiting. We are calling your name. Can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear it? The investigation remains open. The music remains unexplained. And somewhere in the mountains of Washington State, in a forest that has never been fully mapped, in a cabin that appears on no chart, an old gramophone is spinning. The waltz plays on. The dance continues. And the lost souls wait, patient as the trees themselves, for the next lonely wanderer to hear the call and answer. This concludes the known record of the Black Pine Lookout Tower incidents. Whether it concludes the story itself is a question that no one has yet been able to answer. Listen. The music is playing. Can you hear it? I filed hundreds of incident reports in this park, but this one never made it into the system. Some things don't disappear here. They're removed, and I was ordered to stop asking why. My name is Thomas Reed, and I have been a park ranger in Tongass National Forest for 14 years. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest stretching across southeast Alaska, the largest national forest in the United States. I have walked trails that no tourist will ever see, ventured into valleys where the trees grow so thick the sun never reaches the ground, and spent weeks alone in wilderness so remote that rescue would take days to arrive. I thought I understood these woods. I thought I had earned their respect through years of service and sacrifice. I was wrong. There are things in Tongass that do not care how long you have worn the uniform. There are things that have been here since before the Tlingit people named these waters, since before the glaciers carved these fjords, since before humanity took its first stumbling steps out of Africa. And in December of last year, I met one of them. The call came through on a Thursday evening, just as the winter darkness was settling over the ranger station like a burial shroud. December in southeast Alaska means roughly 6 hours of gray twilight that passes for daylight, bookended by endless night. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and a storm system was moving in from the Gulf of Alaska, promising another foot of snow on top of the 3 feet already blanketing the forest. It was the kind of night when sensible people stayed indoors, when even the wildlife sought shelter, when the forest itself seemed to hold its breath against the killing cold. The report was simple enough. A hiking party of 4 had failed to check in at their scheduled waypoint near Mendenhall Glacier. They were 3 days overdue. Given the weather conditions, the decision was made to send a search team at first light. I was assigned to lead the effort, paired with Aaron Mitchell, a ranger 10 years my junior who had transferred to Tongass from the lower 48 2 years prior. Aaron was competent, physically fit, and eager to prove himself. He reminded me of myself at that age, before the forest had taught me humility through a series of increasingly harsh lessons. We set out at dawn, which in December meant around 9 in the morning. The sky was the color of wet concrete, heavy with clouds that promised the forecasted storm. Our breath crystallized in the air, forming ice crystals that sparkled briefly before falling to the snow. The silence was absolute. No birds called, no wind stirred the branches. Just the crunch of our snowshoes and the rhythmic hiss of our breathing, sounds that seemed almost sacrilegious in that profound stillness. The missing hikers had been following a backcountry route that wound through some of the most isolated terrain in the park. Old-growth forest gave way to glacial valleys, then climbed into alpine zones where nothing grew but lichen and the hardiest of mosses. It was beautiful country, in the way that things which can kill you are often beautiful. The mountains did not care if you lived or died. The cold would take you without malice, simply because that is what cold does. I had seen it happen before, experienced hikers who made one wrong decision and paid for it with everything they had. We found the first sign around noon. A backpack, half buried in snow, its contents scattered across a small clearing. Aaron spotted it first, calling out and pointing with his ski pole. We approached carefully, alert for any sign of the hikers or any indication of what had happened. The pack had been torn open, not unzipped but ripped apart, the fabric shredded as if by enormous claws. The contents were strewn in a rough circle around it. Clothing, food packets, a first aid kit, everything a hiker would carry, abandoned in the snow. I knelt beside the pack, examining the damage. The tears in the fabric were deep and irregular, not the clean cuts that a knife would make. Whatever had done this had used raw strength, tearing through the reinforced nylon like it was tissue paper. I looked at Aaron and saw my own concern reflected in his face. There were tracks around the clearing, but they made no sense. Some appeared human, boot prints similar to what the missing hikers would have made. But overlapping them were other prints, larger, elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe. They were too big to be bear, too narrow to be moose. And they were fresh, not more than a day old based on the snow accumulation. We followed the tracks deeper into the forest, moving slowly, our rifles now unslung and held ready. The trees here were ancient Sitka spruce, their trunks wider than cars, their branches draped with pale green lichen that hung like the beards of old men. The canopy blocked what little light the overcast sky provided, plunging us into a perpetual twilight that made distance deceptive, and shadows seemed to move at the edge of vision. Around 2 in the afternoon, we found the campsite, or what remained of it. 2 tents had been erected in a small clearing, positioned correctly to take advantage of the natural windbreak provided by a rock outcropping. Standard setup, the kind any experienced hiker would use, but the tents had been destroyed, not collapsed by snow or blown down by wind. Destroyed. The fabric hung in ribbons from the bent and twisted poles. The contents had been dragged out and scattered, sleeping bags torn apart, their insulation strewn across the snow like bizarre confetti. And there was blood. A great deal of blood. It had soaked into the snow around the larger tent, creating a frozen red stain that spread outward in a rough circle. More blood spattered the trees nearby, arterial spray that had frozen in mid-flight, forming grotesque icicles that hung from the lower branches. The smell hit me despite the cold, that copper tang that any ranger learns to recognize, the scent of violent death. Aaron made a sound, something between a gasp and a retch. I put my hand on his shoulder, steadying him, though I was not sure my own legs were entirely trustworthy at that moment. In 14 years, I had seen death in many forms. Drownings, falls, hypothermia. Once, a bear attack that had left a hiker barely recognizable. But I had never seen anything like this. The sheer volume of blood, the savage destruction of the campsite, the obvious violence of whatever had happened here. We searched the area, moving carefully, documenting everything. I took photographs while Aaron logged GPS coordinates and made notes. We found personal effects scattered throughout the clearing. Wallets with identification confirming this was indeed our missing party. A satellite phone, crushed and useless. A flare gun, unfired, still in its case. Whatever had happened fast. Too fast for the hikers to mount any kind of defense. We found 3 of the 4 bodies before sunset. They had been dragged from the campsite in different directions, left in the snow like discarded toys. The condition of the remains told a story I did not want to understand. They had not simply been killed, they had been fed upon. Large portions of flesh had been stripped from the bones, bite marks evident on what remained, marks too large to be any animal I could identify. The faces were largely intact, frozen in expressions of terror so profound that I knew they had seen their attacker, had understood what was happening to them in those final moments. The 4th hiker, a woman named Sarah Chen, according to her identification, was missing. We found a blood trail leading away from the campsite toward the glacier, but it disappeared into a crevasse field that would be suicide to navigate in the failing light. I made the decision to mark our position, document what we had found, and return with a larger team and proper equipment. Aaron was silent as we made camp that night, setting up our tent a full mile from the massacre site. He went through the motions mechanically, his face pale, his hands trembling despite the insulated gloves. I did not try to engage him in conversation. Some things cannot be processed through words. They have to settle into the mind slowly, like sediment in disturbed water, until you can look at them without the world tilting. I took first watch, sitting outside the tent with my rifle across my lap, watching the darkness between the trees. The storm had held off, leaving the sky clear enough for stars to appear, cold points of light impossibly distant. The aurora borealis rippled across the northern horizon, green and purple curtains of light that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Now they just illuminated the forest in shifting, uncertain ways, making every shadow seem to move, making every tree trunk look like a figure standing just at the edge of perception. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. It started as a sound at the very edge of hearing, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. A cry, somewhere between a scream and a howl, rising from the direction of the glacier. It was not a wolf. I knew wolf howls. This was different, higher pitched, with a quality that resonated in my chest cavity, that seemed to vibrate through my bones. It held for several seconds, impossibly long for any animal I knew, before fading into silence. Then it came again, closer. I was on my feet without deciding to stand, my rifle raised, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trees stood silent and still. Nothing moved, but I could feel something out there. A presence that pressed against my awareness like a physical weight. The temperature seemed to drop even further, the cold becoming sharp and immediate in a way it had not been before. The cry came a 3rd time, and now I could hear something else beneath it. Words. Or something like words. A voice speaking in a language I did not recognize. Syllables that rose and fell in patterns that almost made sense, that my brain kept trying to parse into meaning without success. I woke Aaron. He emerged from the tent bleary-eyed, confused, but snapped to alertness when he heard the sound. We stood back to back, our flashlights creating a small circle of light in the vast darkness of the forest, our breath forming clouds that dissipated into the frigid air. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I could feel whatever was out there, circling us just beyond the reach of our lights. I caught glimpses of movement between the trees, a shape that was too tall, too thin, moving with a strange gliding motion that made my mind rebel. And then I saw the eyes. They appeared in the darkness, reflecting our flashlight beams with a pale, cold luminescence. They were positioned too far apart, set in what must have been an impossibly wide face, and they were high, at least 8 feet off the ground. They watched us with an intelligence that froze my blood. Not an animal, something else. Something that had been human once, perhaps, or that remembered what being human had meant. I raised my rifle, sighting on those eyes, my finger on the trigger. The eyes did not move, did not blink, just watched, with a patience that suggested time meant nothing to whatever wore them. Seconds stretched into minutes. My arms began to ache from holding the rifle steady. My breath came in short, sharp gasps that crystallized in the air. Then, without warning, the eyes rose higher. Whatever possessed them was standing up, unfolding from a crouch. rising to a height that I could not rationally accept. 10 feet, 12 feet, perhaps more. The movement was silent, utterly silent. No sound of snow compacting or branches breaking. It simply rose, those terrible eyes never leaving mine. Aaron fired. The rifle shot shattered the silence like breaking glass, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating a shape I will never be able to fully describe. Too tall, too thin. Limbs that bent at the wrong angles, ending in hands that were more like claws. And a face. God help me, a face that was almost human, stretched and distorted, the mouth impossibly wide, filled with teeth that gleamed wetly in the split second of light. The shape vanished, not retreated, not fled, simply was not there anymore, as if the darkness had swallowed it whole. Aaron kept firing until his rifle clicked empty, the shots echoing through the forest, disturbing snow from the branches overhead. I grabbed his arm, stopped him from reloading. We listened. Silence. The forest was utterly still, as if every living thing within miles was holding its breath. Even the wind had died, leaving nothing but the faint hiss of falling snow, the first flakes of the approaching storm. We broke camp immediately. There was no discussion, no debate about what to do. We packed our gear in frantic silence, our movements jerky with adrenaline, and started hiking out. Protocol demanded we remain at our position until the search team arrived. Protocol could go to hell. Whatever we had seen, whatever had killed those hikers, was still out there, and I was not going to wait for it to decide we were worth hunting. The hike out should have taken 6 hours. It took 12. The storm hit around 3 in the morning, reducing visibility to a few feet, turning the forest into a maze of identical trees and featureless snow. We navigated by GPS, moving slowly, fighting through drifts that came up to our waists. Several times, I was certain we were being followed. I would catch movement at the edge of my vision, a shape between the trees that vanished when I turned to look directly at it. Aaron saw it too. Neither of us acknowledged it aloud. Speaking it would make it real in a way we were not prepared to accept. Dawn came as a gradual lightening of the darkness, the gray light filtering through the clouds, turning the world into a monochrome photograph. We reached the trailhead around noon, stumbling out of the forest like survivors of some great disaster. The ranger station was another mile down the road, but I had never been so grateful to see the parking lot, the maintained road, the signs of human presence. We filed our report that afternoon, the official version stripped of anything that could not be explained by conventional means. A bear attack, we suggested. A grizzly, perhaps drawn by the hikers' food supply, or a mother protecting cubs. It did not explain the condition of the bodies, the bite marks that were too large, the destruction that seemed calculated rather than wild. But it was an explanation that fit within the framework of the world as it was supposed to be. The alternative was unacceptable. The search team found Sarah Chen the next day, or what remained of her. She had made it almost 2 miles from the campsite before whatever was pursuing her had caught up. The coroner's report noted the same unexplained injuries as the other victims. The case was classified as a bear attack. The file closed, the families notified. Another tragic accident in the Alaskan wilderness. The kind of thing that happened from time to time. But I knew better, and the thing that terrified me most was not what I had seen that night. It was the conversation I had 2 weeks later with a Tlingit elder named William Ketchikan, who had worked as a guide in these forests for over 50 years. I found him in a bar in Juneau, nursing a beer and watching the snow fall outside the window. When I told him what I had seen, he did not laugh. He did not dismiss me as crazy. He just nodded slowly, his weathered face grave. He called it by its name, Wendigo. A spirit of winter and hunger, of the desperate acts committed when starvation drives humans beyond the boundaries of their humanity. He said the old stories spoke of it, warnings passed down through generations, tales of those who ate the flesh of their own kind and became something no longer human. The hunger consumed them, he said, and it never stopped, could never stop. They would hunt forever, always starving, always needing more. I asked him how to kill it. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You do not kill what is already dead, he told me. You do not destroy what has surrendered its soul in exchange for eternal hunger. You can only avoid it. Stay away from the deep places in winter. Never travel alone. And if you hear the voice calling in the darkness, if you see the eyes watching from beyond the firelight, run. Run and do not stop until you reach safety, and pray that it is not already following your scent. I returned to work. What else could I do? The forest was still there, still vast and wild and indifferent to human concerns. Hikers still came. Tourists still marveled at the glaciers and the wildlife, and I still put on my uniform and did my job. But I was different now. I understood something I had not understood before. We are guests in these woods, tolerated perhaps, ignored most of the time. But there are things here older than human memory. Things that the rational world refuses to acknowledge, and they do not share our assumptions about the order of things. Aaron Mitchell transferred out 3 months after the incident. He never spoke to me about what happened, never acknowledged what we had both seen. The last I heard, he was working at a ranger station in Arizona, as far from cold and snow and ancient forests as he could get. I do not blame him. Some people cannot live with the knowledge of what exists in the dark spaces of the world. They have to forget, have to convince themselves it was a dream or a hallucination, have to rebuild the comforting illusion that human beings sit at the top of the food chain. I cannot forget. Every night, when the darkness falls and the cold settles over the forest, I remember those eyes. I remember the shape rising up, impossibly tall, watching me with a hunger that had no end. And I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere in the depths of Tongass, in the places where no trail goes and no human ventures, it waits. Patient, eternal, knowing that eventually I will return to its territory, that eventually the forest will call me back, as it always does, and this time I might not be lucky enough to escape. There have been other incidents since then, hikers who vanished without a trace, hunters who stumbled out of the forest raving about monsters only to be sedated and transferred to psychiatric facilities. Bodies found in conditions that no bear or wolf could explain, marked by teeth that match no known animal. Each time the reports are filed with careful omissions. Each time the truth is buried under acceptable explanations. The system does not want to know. The system cannot afford to know. I have compiled my own files, unofficial records of every incident that does not fit the narrative, dates and locations and details that would destroy careers if they ever became public. I keep them hidden, backed up in multiple locations, waiting for the day when someone with the power to do something might finally be willing to listen. I do not expect that day to come. The world is not ready to accept what lives in its last wild places. Perhaps it never will be, but the truth exists whether we accept it or not. In the frozen forests of Southeast Alaska, in the shadow of glaciers that were ancient when humanity was young, something hunts. It has many names in many languages, but they all point to the same truth. There are things that should not be. Things that were human once, or that wear human faces as masks for something far older. They have been here since before recorded history, and they will be here long after our civilization crumbles to dust. I still patrol these woods, still answer calls and file reports and pretend that the world is ordinary, that the darkness holds nothing worse than bears and hypothermia. But when the winter wind howls through the branches, when the aurora ripples across the sky, and the temperature drops to levels that can kill in minutes, I listen, I watch, and I remember what William Ketchikan told me, words that echo through my mind every time I venture into the deep forest. The Wendigo does not forget. It does not forgive. And once it has your scent, once it has marked you as prey, you are never truly safe again. Not in the forest, not in the city, not anywhere. Because the hunger that drives it is eternal, and it will wait forever for the chance to feed. I have filed hundreds of incident reports in this park, but this one never made it into the system. Some things do not disappear here, they are removed, and I was ordered to stop asking why. I stopped asking, but I never stopped remembering. And now I'm telling you, whoever reads this, whatever you do with this information, be careful in the wild places, respect the cold, fear the darkness, and if you hear something calling your name in the frozen night, if you see eyes watching from the shadows between the trees, do not investigate, do not be curious, do not tell yourself it must be an animal, must be your imagination, must be anything other than what it is. Run, run, and do not stop, because some truths are worse than death, and some hungers can never be satisfied. The forest remembers, the forest waits, and in its coldest heart, where the ice never melts and the sun never reaches, the Wendigo still hunts. I pray you never meet it. I pray you never learn why the Tlingit elders speak of these things only in whispers, only when the fire is high and the doors are locked. I pray you live your entire life believing that monsters are fiction, that the darkness holds nothing worse than what science has already named and categorized. But if you do meet it, If you do see those eyes in the night, that impossible shape rising from the shadows, remember my words. Remember Thomas Reed, the ranger who survived to tell this story. And do whatever you have to do to escape, because in the end, survival is all that matters. And against what hunts in these forests, survival is the only victory we can hope for. The Tongass keeps its secrets, but not this one, not anymore.